The reason I am so interested in France, I think, and love it so much, which I do, is because, and it's difficult to imagine now, when I was a young boy, and I come from the English middle classes, the first foreign place I ever went to in my life when I was about 6 was France. I got on a boat from somewhere like New Haven and I went to Dieppe. And I got off at Dieppe and I found myself in another world. The food was not the same. The streets didn't look the same. The policemen were not the same. Nothing was the same. And best and worst of all, they didn't understand the language I was speaking. It was a whole new world, and I was completely wide-eyed with wonder at this extraordinary country I was in. At the time, and I'm thinking now it was about 1949, all that part of France around Dieppe was bombarded, ruined, and so immediately I had some idea that something had happened. Even as a child, I knew something terrible had happened here, and my parents told me this is where the war had been fought, and I grew up a little bit with the history of this. At school, the first language I ever learned, badly, was French. I was sent on a French exchange when I was 12 to Paris and fell in love with a French girl, and that didn't come to anything, but that doesn't matter. The point is that my experience of France was always wide-eyed, and it was always a place of wonder to me. And then when I grew up and became a writer, I had learned more about French history and become fascinated particularly by the fact that these two countries, France and England, my two countries really, had had histories that were both so different and so much the same, that we'd done a lot of invading of each other. And it's interesting, I also discovered when I started as a writer going into French schools, discovering how little in French schools they knew of English history. And when I went in English schools, I found how little we knew of French history. And that both appalled me and fascinated me. The truth is, of course, we learn our own histories, and we don't learn the perspective of other countries. And the more I came to, I suppose, know both countries, and to understand that there was this extraordinary joined history, but also a great divergence of culture and philosophy, and I realized that I belonged in both places, which was quite uncomfortable. But it's where I wanted to be. And I spent so many holidays with my own children then, in France. My son married a French girl. We got to know that family very well, so I had another family in France now. And they had a house where? Down in the Béarn, in the south of France, by the Pyrenees. And by this time I spoke better English. Why? Because I'd been into lots of French schools and talked to kids in college and stuff like this. And the one thing that they insist upon in France is that you speak French. It's unreasonable, isn't it? So you had to try. So my schoolboy French gradually became better and better. And I discovered something rather wonderful. And that was that if you speak French to French children in a class, they think it's very funny. And that's a really good way to start with children, that they smile at what you say. And then what happens sometimes is that you use the wrong word and the teachers tick you off and say, non, non, monsieur, on dit pas ça. And the children love that because it's another adult being ticked over by their teacher. There's all that sort of stuff. I really liked the whole business of being in French schools. And so I went back and back and back. My children by this time were all grown up and I had this French family. So it just became closer and closer and closer. And then there was one thing that occurred to me, I suppose, when I was in my 40s. And that was what had happened in France during the Second World War. And I think probably, back in memory, that was what Dieppe looked like when I arrived all those years before. It was in my head that this place hadn't just been bombarded, as we had been in England, it had been invaded. The country had been humiliated, there were jackboots walking around the streets, it was just this whole world which we in this country have never had since you Normans came over here 1,000 years ago. So it's out of our understanding what that is like, which is interesting for today, because the main reason, as you know full well, that we have something called Europe now is because the French and the Germans decided after the Second World War, ça suffit, we're never going to go there again, we're going to create a trading bloc, so it is so tight we'll never have to fight wars again. I don't think anyone understands that unless you understand what war has done to these countries. And we've been stood back from that. We have La Manche in between us, which has protected us, but also it's divided us psychologically. So you have a very complex situation, which I think is interesting. So I find myself in the Béarn, going into this little village of Lescun with 100 people, no more, because I wanted to go and stand with one foot in France and one foot in Spain. It's as stupid as that, because I'm an islander. I don't know what it is like to stand in two countries at the same time. We found this little place on the map, Lescun, tiny little village, one inn to stay at, and I was sitting there one evening, the first evening we were there, having supper in this lovely little inn, which is still there and still the same, makes its own yogurt, it's just amazing. So we were sitting there, and this girl comes up to me. She's about 11, I suppose. And she's very polite. Bonsoir, monsieur. Est-ce que tu peux signer mon livre? And she produced a book called Cheval de Guerre, which I had written some time before, and she said she was studying it at school. I said, how did you know I was here? She said, well, my uncle keeps the hotel and noticed your name, which when you signed in, and he knew the book I'd been reading and had told me there's this man there, he's called Morpurgo, it might be the same person. So she turned up and she wanted a book signed. So I signed it. And then she said, and will you come, my father says, to have lunch tomorrow? He's the mayor of the village of Lescun, and he lives up the hill on the way to the mountains. He would like to invite you for pâté and wine tomorrow. So my wife and I turn up and we have pâté and wine and we start talking. I come from a rural part of Devon. I live on a farm. This man was a farmer. So we started talking, farmer to farmer, a lot in common. I couldn't understand his French very well because he spoke with a very heavy accent, but we managed, you know. And after a bit I said, did you grow up here? Were you born here? He said, this is my father's farm. My father was born here too. And I was born here. And I said, so you were here then when France was occupied? And he said, yes, I was here. And I said, I can't remember how the conversation came up or when. I said, and how did you find having Germans in your village? He said, oh, they're quite nice. They didn't do anything terrible. They gave us chocolate, played football. There was one horrible thing that happened at the end of the war, which I was told about. And I said, why were they here? It's a tiny little place, why were they here? And they said, because they were guarding the frontier, he told me, because people were escaping over into Spain. And many of them were Jews and Jewish children and that sort of thing. And then he told me something wonderful. He said there was an old lady living outside the village, and we didn't even know this when the war was there, when the Germans were there. But all the way through the last 2 years of the war, during the occupation, this lady had the last safe house in France. So you had refugees, very often Jewish people, being passed down, Allied airmen, all sorts of people being passed down, French people who didn't want to have to go and work in Germany, they were being passed down, safe house to safe house. And they ended up in this house in the village of Lescun. And I said, you mean no one really, we didn't know at all what was going on. And that woman saved the lives of hundreds of children. And I did some more research, and I discovered, of course, that these safe houses went all the way up through France, that it was a resistance, and we knew what these people were risking. So that's why I wrote it, Waiting for Anya, because I heard about this extraordinary courage. And then, of course, it was becoming, as I was thinking about it, more and more relevant to today, because we have people trying to go to a safe place because they're being bombed out of their own places, they're being driven out of their own places. It's happening all over the world. It's an issue with which every single country in the world is having to deal with, and normally we deal with it badly. Therefore, it's a book worth writing. So that's why I wrote it. I'm sorry I've talked too much.
No, but thank you. It was fascinating. I have another question. So the book was adapted into a film.
Yes.
We know that you're a strong believer of literature's impact on children and the importance of literature on their education.
Yeah.
What do you think this film adaptation will help carry the message of the book? Like help reach new audiences?
Well, that's the important thing. It's reaching new audiences. I mean, you hope, of course you do as a writer, that the books will reach the audience that you want, which is every child. But that's not going to happen. And the great thing, if you can, is to reach out to them in the medium which they actually understand very well, which is film, or theatre, but film primarily. And to me, yes, it's important that the film has integrity, that it's a good film, a great film, and it is a terrific film. I'm very pleased with it. But for me, the most important thing, I suppose, is that children are exposed to, intelligently, to the sensitive issues which face us all. Why? Because the lives of children now are dramatically different from how it was when I was a small person. When I was a small person, I'm absolutely sure it's the same in France. In my generation, I'm 76 now. In the 1940s and 50s, by and large, parents could control what it was that children were exposed to. You had radio, nice little stories on the radio, and you went and played outside. Those were the kind of choices you had. What you didn't have was coming in on your phone or on your iPad, visions of the world outside, which are really, really hard for children to deal with. And make no mistake, these days it is completely normal and common for them to press a button and it's a vision of hell. It's Syria, a bombed house, a child being carried out into a hospital. How do they process that kind of thing when they are 6, 7, 8, 9? How do you process that kind of tragedy going on before your eyes? How do you differentiate between that and a fictional film which comes on just later or you switch over to? So it's more and more important that they think about these things young and they are told about them and they can use both their imagination and their knowledge and their understanding, and books do that. Books that are dealing with these sort of tragedies that are going on all around us. So if you take, for instance, the extreme, take the worst kind of horror, which is the Holocaust. So what do? Do you wait until people are in their 20s and 30s before you pass on that this is the depth of evil to which mankind can sink? Or do you begin quite early on to say, look, there was a time when this is how people behaved? And you show them, without traumatizing them, you tell a story around it about real people who lived in those times and who went and lived through these difficulties and horrors. But do it in a way which doesn't traumatize, but which makes them ask questions. I mean, finally, that's what education's about. It's not about just learning facts and regurgitating them, which happens in both your system and ours, massively. It's about dealing with doubt and asking important questions. And the great thing after a book or a really good film is that you come out not with a solution, because there are no solutions, but asking more questions, so that you come to a place like this, a library, and you find out more, you find out more. That's what education's really about, and I think your country and my country has very often lost this completely. We've been driven into this world of achievement, of standards, without understanding quite what the whole thing's for. We seem to have forgotten that. So yeah, books are the way to knowledge and understanding, and good films can be too. Actually, good books, but there are plenty of bad books which don't help at all, so there we are.